Imagine standing in front of 30 people you know, people whose opinions matter, people you respect. And suddenly, in one moment, feeling exposed, embarrassed, and powerless. Every glance, every whisper, every judgmental eye seems to pierce right through you. That was the reality I faced, a moment that could have broken me. But what happened next turned everything upside down, because sometimes, the most crushing humiliation can become the stage for your greatest triumph. Today, I'm going to take you through a story of patience, strategy, and the power of truth. How one carefully orchestrated moment transformed shame into empowerment. How resilience and calm under pressure can turn judgment into recognition. And how the seemingly impossible can become a lesson in strength and victory. From the initial shock to the dramatic revelation that left everyone stunned, this story is not just about revenge, it's about rising above, reclaiming your narrative, and proving that no amount of public scrutiny can define who you truly are. So stay with me till the end, because by the time this story concludes, you won't just hear what happened, you'll feel the tension, the triumph, and the unstoppable power of composure, patience, and truth. This isn't just a story, it's a blueprint for turning adversity into your own unstoppable strength. The moment the grounding began in front of all 30 relatives, the air felt heavier than it should have. Every word spoken cut deeper than the room's echoes, leaving a sting that was both personal and public. There was no quiet corner to retreat to, no privacy in which to process the humiliation. The entire family had become a tribunal, a jury, and a gallery all at once. The protagonist's heartbeat sped up, a drum of tension against ribs that suddenly felt too tight, as the eyes of parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and even distant relatives bore into them. Each gaze carried judgment, curiosity, or mild amusement, none offering sympathy or understanding. There was a surreal aspect to it, the way the words felt disproportionately severe, as though the punishment was not about the act itself, but about asserting dominance in front of witnesses. With every sentence, a mix of disbelief and shame coursed through the protagonist, intertwining with the undeniable sense that this moment would be remembered and retold among the family for years. The room seemed to shrink, pressing in from all sides as the humiliation compounded, amplifying even the smallest gestures, like a sigh or a raised eyebrow, into monumental judgments. Thoughts raced, questioning why such a public display was necessary, why the transgression couldn't be addressed privately, and why everyone's attention had to be weaponized in this way. The mind replayed the event in fragments, focusing on the unkindness of being singled out, the imbalance of authority, and the impossibility of escaping the scene. Humiliation in this form is not just about being corrected, it is about being reduced, rendered small and visible, stripped of dignity while surrounded by witnesses who are powerless or complicit in their silence. It creates a cage, an invisible barrier that constrains both movement and speech, trapping the protagonist in the gaze of the family and forcing them to endure the spectacle. Every attempt to respond, to explain, or even to make eye contact feels futile, because the room is orchestrated to ensure the individual's discomfort is maximized. Yet beneath the shame and embarrassment, a spark of awareness grows, the realization that being publicly judged is also an opportunity for future vindication, that the humiliation can be observed, analyzed, and later reversed. In these moments, there is a complex layering of emotion, a combination of vulnerability, anger, and the instinctive understanding that this spectacle, painful as it is, may sow the seeds of a narrative where truth eventually overturns public perception and restores agency in a way that silence or private confrontation never could. The immediate surge of shock and embarrassment was like an electric current that ran through every nerve, leaving the protagonist stunned and hyper-aware of the surrounding faces. The words spoken and the tone used created a sudden collapse of composure, as if the ground beneath had shifted, leaving no secure footing. Each relative's expression seemed magnified, every frown or smirk etched into memory with an intensity that made it impossible to ignore. There was a sharp contrast between the protagonist's inner turmoil and the outward expectation to remain calm, a tension that made every blink, every shift of posture feel painfully noticeable. The embarrassment was not just about being reprimanded, it was about the layering of authority, family observation, and public judgment, a trifecta that intensified the sting. Even casual comments or murmurs from the crowd felt like added pressure, amplifying the sensation of exposure, like being under a spotlight that highlighted every imperfection and misstep. Internally, the protagonist's thoughts raced, questioning the fairness of the situation, dissecting each word and its delivery, trying to find logic in what seemed blatantly disproportionate. The suddenness of the public humiliation left little room for immediate defense, forcing a combination of shock, disbelief, and simmering indignation to settle into a quiet but potent awareness. There was also a subtle sense of betrayal, a recognition that the audience of relatives, whether intentionally or not, had become witnesses to an ordeal that should have remained private. Each eye in the room became a mirror reflecting a distorted version of self, emphasizing flaws and magnifying perceived shortcomings. The feeling was suffocating, a mixture of anger, hurt, and the sharp sting of being misunderstood in the very space where support might have been expected. The protagonist became acutely conscious of body language, tone, and even breathing, as if each action could betray inner turmoil or confirm the judgment being levied. Yet, despite the intensity of these emotions, a part of the mind was already noting the implications of this exposure, how a moment so publicly charged could later serve as a pivot point, a story of resilience and eventual vindication. In this mixture of humiliation and clarity, the protagonist begins to see the scenario not merely as a moment of shame, but as a crucible for strategy, a situation that, when approached with patience and awareness, holds the seeds for turning embarrassment into empowerment, observation into leverage, and a public reprimand into a narrative that might one day be reversed with undeniable truth and authority. The dynamics of family during such a moment intensified the feeling of isolation. Even though the room was filled with familiar faces, each relative's presence carried layers of expectation, loyalty, and judgment, creating a silent pressure that weighed heavily on the protagonist. There was a subtle choreography in the way eyes moved across the room, glances exchanged between family members, and slight nods or raised eyebrows that seemed to confirm the authority figure's position. This web of unspoken communication magnified the sense of scrutiny, making every word spoken or action taken feel like it could be dissected and debated long after the moment had passed. The protagonist became hyper-aware of how relationships and alliances within the family influenced the perception of the event, recognizing that some relatives' expressions of sympathy were muted by fear of challenging authority or disrupting family cohesion. Each interaction, no matter how brief, carried significance, shaping the narrative in real time and making it impossible to separate personal feelings from social optics. The family, intentionally or not, had become both audience and enforcer, turning a single disciplinary action into a spectacle that demanded emotional resilience. Internally, the protagonist navigated conflicting waves of anger, hurt, and strategic observation, understanding that outward expressions might need to be carefully controlled while the mind cataloged evidence, inconsistencies, and reactions. There was a constant tension between vulnerability and composure, a recognition that any misstep could be used to reinforce the public perception of wrongdoing. At the same time, the protagonist noticed subtle shifts in posture, tone, and attention among relatives, cues that indicated where loyalties and doubts lay, and which pieces of the scenario might later support vindication. The family's involvement transformed a personal grievance into a complex social performance, where power, reputation, and influence intermingled, and every expression had a layered meaning beyond its immediate appearance. Yet within this charged atmosphere, the protagonist found clarity, understanding that family scrutiny, while initially painful, created the conditions for a dramatic reversal, an opportunity for truth to be revealed in a way that could not be ignored. The complex web of social dynamics became a stage where patience, careful observation, and the eventual presentation of evidence could turn humiliation into empowerment, shame into recognition, and private resilience into public triumph, demonstrating that in such situations, awareness of relationships and timing is as powerful as the truth itself, and the interplay of authority and perception sets the foundation for eventual vindication and a lasting shift in how respect and judgment are distributed within the family structure. The reactions of the relatives created a complex and often contradictory atmosphere, where every movement and expression carried weight beyond its apparent significance. Some faces reflected surprise, others confusion, and a few masked amusement that only heightened the protagonist's discomfort. These reactions were not isolated, they were part of an interconnected network of judgment, gossip, and expectation, where each relative's response influenced the perception of everyone else in the room. The protagonist became acutely aware of this ripple effect, understanding that a single gesture, A glance, a frown, a whispered comment could shift the mood, reinforce assumptions, or amplify embarrassment. There was a sense of being both observed and interpreted, as if every reaction was a small verdict contributing to an overall judgment. The murmurs of relatives felt like waves of scrutiny, subtle yet relentless, pressing in and forcing the protagonist to measure every facial expression and tone of voice. This constant observation created a tension that was physical as well as emotional. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker, and even breathing became a conscious act under the weight of collective attention. The protagonist began to analyze not only the content of the reactions, but also the patterns, who seemed sympathetic, who aligned with the authority figure, and who was silently evaluating the unfolding scenario. Each realization added layers to the internal narrative, revealing both the fragility of perception and the power of social influence. Amidst this pressure, there was an acute awareness of the opportunity that the relatives' reactions represented. Their judgments, though uncomfortable, were temporary and dependent on incomplete information. The protagonist noted the imbalance between public perception and private truth, recognizing that the discomfort and scrutiny could later serve as leverage when facts were revealed. This understanding transformed the initial embarrassment into a strategic observation, where each subtle cue from the relatives became a piece of evidence for eventual vindication. The room, filled with authority, judgment, and expectation, functioned as both challenge and catalyst, highlighting vulnerabilities while also laying the groundwork for reversal. Observing how opinions formed, shifted, and spread among the family emphasized the importance of timing, strategy, and presentation when confronting social judgment. In this web of observation, interpretation, and influence, the protagonist realized that the relatives' reactions, though seemingly humiliating in the moment, were part of a narrative that could be turned, a stage where truth and preparation could transform scrutiny into acknowledgement, embarrassment into empowerment, and a fleeting moment of judgment into a lasting testament to resilience, awareness, and the eventual triumph of honesty over appearances. The imbalance of authority in the room was palpable, creating a pressure that seemed almost physical, pressing down on the protagonist from every angle. The person delivering the grounding wielded not just familial power, but the implicit weight of expectation, tradition, and hierarchy, turning a private matter into a spectacle where obedience was demanded and dissent was discouraged. Each word spoken carried authority beyond its literal meaning, designed to establish control and assert dominance, leaving little room for explanation or defense. The protagonist, acutely aware of this imbalance, felt the tension between compliance and resistance, the internal struggle between accepting punishment and recognizing its unfairness. There was a sense that the entire environment was structured to reinforce the authority figure's position, from the arrangement of the room to the attention of relatives, each element contributing to a landscape where questioning or challenging the decision felt not only inappropriate, but impossible. This dynamic heightened the protagonist's awareness of power as both social and psychological, where influence extends beyond explicit commands into subtle cues of expectation, posture, and gaze. The imbalance created a form of confinement, a cage of authority in which every reaction was monitored and every expression potentially judged, and even small acts of resistance risked magnifying scrutiny or generating additional punishment. Despite the overwhelming pressure, there was a sharp clarity that emerged within the protagonist, a recognition of how authority functions in public spaces and how its impact is magnified by an audience of witnesses. This understanding brought both frustration and a strategic awareness. The imbalance, while oppressive, also highlighted vulnerabilities in the system of power. Observing how relatives responded, how they nodded, murmured, or stayed silent, the protagonist realized that authority depends as much on perception and consensus as on action, and that when perception shifts, the apparent power can be undermined. This insight planted the seed of future reversal, the idea that a carefully timed intervention, grounded in truth and supported by undeniable evidence, could neutralize the imbalance, turning public judgment into a stage for vindication. The psychological pressure exerted by authority also revealed the protagonist's resilience, testing patience, composure, and the ability to endure humiliation, while simultaneously planning for eventual restoration of reputation. In this environment, the interplay between control, observation, and response became a complex strategy, where understanding power dynamics, audience influence, and the timing of truth creates the conditions for turning what seems like dominance into exposure, shame into accountability, and a moment of public oppression into a carefully orchestrated reversal, setting the stage for justice, recognition, and the ultimate triumph of awareness over imposed authority. The sense of being trapped and powerless in front of everyone amplified the intensity of the situation, transforming what might have been a simple correction into a deeply personal ordeal. Surrounded by 30 relatives, each with their own expectations, judgments, and alliances, the protagonist felt the walls of the room closing in, an invisible cage constructed from social pressure and authority. There was no way to escape the scrutiny, no private corner to gather composure or rethink responses, and every movement seemed magnified, as if under a magnifying glass. The body reacted instinctively to this confinement, heart racing, stomach tight, hands trembling slightly, and thoughts spinning in an effort to reconcile the reality of the punishment with the understanding of its unfairness. Powerlessness became layered, not just in the inability to physically leave, but in the recognition that each relative's gaze could reinforce the narrative being imposed, shaping perception in a way that was beyond the protagonist's immediate control. It was an intricate blend of social, emotional, and psychological confinement, where each whispered comment, sideways glance, or suppressed chuckle acted as a subtle reminder of authority and judgment. Within this framework, even attempts to explain or defend oneself seemed futile, because the environment had been structured to ensure compliance and suppress challenge. Yet amid the suffocating sense of helplessness, a sharp awareness began to emerge, a recognition that being observed and judged by many also meant that every detail of the unfolding scenario was visible, recorded in memory, and potentially exploitable for later vindication. This duality, simultaneously powerless and strategically aware, created a tension that was both frustrating and illuminating. Each moment of observation, each micro-reaction of the relatives, became data, cataloged silently for future use. There was also an emotional sharpening, a focus on internal resilience, and the ability to endure the injustice without collapsing under it, a preparation for the eventual reversal of the narrative. The protagonist started to see that while immediate action might be constrained, the long-term potential lay in patience, timing, and careful orchestration of truth. The sense of confinement, far from merely crushing, became a crucible for awareness, forcing a heightened sensitivity to social dynamics, the flow of attention, and the influence of perception. In this environment, what initially felt like complete powerlessness was slowly reframed as an opportunity to observe, plan, and ultimately reclaim authority over one's own narrative, laying the groundwork for a dramatic shift where humiliation could transform into empowerment, scrutiny into leverage, and public judgment into a stage for undeniable truth. The quiet fury building inside the protagonist was like a slow-burning fire, one that smoldered beneath the surface while every outward movement demanded composure and restraint. The public nature of the grounding intensified this anger, mixing shame with a powerful sense of injustice that refused to be silenced. Each word and gesture from the authority figure felt deliberately designed to provoke, to assert control, and to make the humiliation more memorable, yet the protagonist learned quickly that responding impulsively would only escalate the situation and further cement the narrative being imposed in front of the family. Instead, the fury became focused, an internal energy that demanded acknowledgement but also demanded careful management, transforming raw emotion into strategic awareness. The tension between feeling deeply wronged and maintaining an outward calm created a dual consciousness, externally measured, internally storming, each thought a calculation of how to endure, and later, how to leverage the moment for vindication. There was an acute awareness that every reaction, whether a flinch, a frown, or a sigh, could be read and interpreted, potentially weaponized against the protagonist, so patience and restraint became forms of silent resistance. At the same time, the anger sharpened perception, heightening the ability to notice small inconsistencies, fleeting expressions, or subtle shifts in tone that might later reveal weakness or opportunity. It became clear that the power of the situation was amplified by the presence of witnesses, and that public humiliation, while designed to diminish, also created a stage where truth could eventually overturn perception. The internal fury fueled a mental cataloging of evidence and observations, the timing of words, the body language of the authority figure, and the reactions of relatives, all pieces of a larger puzzle that could be used to construct an irrefutable narrative of justice. This quiet, controlled rage was not destructive, but analytical, transforming frustration into strategy, impatience into planning, and shame into a growing anticipation of eventual triumph. The protagonist's mind alternated between endurance and tactical insight, knowing that the moment of humiliation, intense as it was, held within it the seeds of reversal and vindication. In this controlled anger, a sense of empowerment quietly emerged, fueled by the understanding that the situation, though designed to subjugate, could be observed, understood, and ultimately reframed in a way that would not only restore dignity, but also turn the initial injustice into a story of cleverness, patience, and moral victory, where the power of truth would confront public perception and the careful orchestration of timing would transform humiliation into undeniable authority. The presence of hidden evidence created an undercurrent of tension that the protagonist could feel but had to keep carefully contained. This evidence, though not immediately visible to the family or the authority figure, held the potential to completely overturn the public narrative being imposed. There was a quiet excitement mixed with anxiety, an understanding that what was about to emerge could expose the truth, but only if revealed at the right moment. The knowledge of having proof, whether in documents, messages, or corroborating accounts, provided a sense of silent power, a reassurance that the humiliation endured was not permanent or absolute. Each glance around the room, each whisper among relatives, reminded the protagonist that perception was fragile and easily manipulated by appearances, yet the hidden evidence offered a counterbalance to that fragility. It was a mental anchor, a secret assurance that the eventual revelation could transform shame into vindication, and that the current power imbalance was temporary. There was also a strategic layer to how the evidence was perceived internally. It could not be revealed too soon, or it would lose impact. It could not be mishandled, or it might be dismissed or questioned. This awareness sharpened the protagonist's focus, turning the humiliation into a calculated endurance, a period of observation and preparation. The hidden proof was not just an object or document, it was a form of leverage, a tool that transformed the protagonist's apparent vulnerability into latent strength. While the family witnessed a display of authority and judgment, the protagonist quietly measured timing, tone, and audience perception, understanding that the eventual presentation of evidence could not only reverse the humiliation, but also redefine the relationships and respect within the room. The existence of this proof created a psychological edge, allowing the protagonist to endure public scrutiny with an internal sense of control, knowing that every whisper, every frown, and every judgmental glance was temporary and could be reframed once the truth was revealed. This dual experience, enduring embarrassment while holding unassailable evidence, became a source of quiet empowerment. Each moment of observation, each cataloging of reactions, strengthened the protagonist's resolve, providing clarity about how to execute a reversal with maximum effect. In this space, humiliation and patience intertwined, creating the conditions for a dramatic shift where hidden evidence could function as both shield and weapon, turning the weight of public judgment into an opportunity for vindication, strategic advantage, and the restoration of dignity in a way that would leave the room irrevocably changed by the undeniable truth. The arrival of the lawyer introduced an entirely new layer of authority and tension into the room, instantly shifting the energy and focus of everyone present. What had been a scene of unilateral control and public humiliation transformed into a moment of suspense, where anticipation and uncertainty hung heavily in the air. The lawyer's presence carried the weight of expertise, legality, and impartiality, an external force that could challenge the narrative imposed by the authority figure. There was an almost cinematic quality to the interruption, the way the door opened or the footsteps approached, signaling that the carefully constructed display of judgment was about to be confronted with undeniable credibility. The protagonist, while already aware of the hidden evidence, now sensed the power of timing magnified. The lawyer's arrival would allow the proof to be presented in a manner that could not be ignored, twisted, or dismissed, ensuring maximum impact. Every relative's attention shifted, some with curiosity, some with skepticism, others with barely concealed surprise, reflecting a collective awareness that the balance of power in the room was about to change. This external authority provided a focal point through which truth could be articulated and verified, validating the protagonist's internal understanding of justice and fairness. The lawyer's role was not just procedural but performative, framing the revelation in a way that demanded acknowledgement from both the authority figure and the family audience. As the lawyer prepared to present the evidence, tension built to a peak, each second stretching as the room collectively held its breath, waiting for the confrontation that would clarify reality. For the protagonist, this moment was both vindicating and intensely satisfying, a culmination of endurance, observation, and strategic patience. The lawyer's presence transformed the scenario from one of unilateral control into a stage for accountability, where hidden truths could be revealed with authority and the power dynamics could be effectively reversed. It highlighted how preparation, timing, and external validation combined to create the conditions for justice, turning what had been a moment of vulnerability into an opportunity for public recognition of fairness. Observing the reactions of relatives as the lawyer intervened underscored the social impact of authoritative truth. Expressions shifted from judgment or doubt to surprise, acknowledgement, and in some cases, silent admiration for the protagonist's patience and insight. The arrival of this external figure crystallized the idea that humiliation and power are temporary when countered with preparation, evidence, and timing, and that the careful orchestration of truth, reinforced by recognized authority, can transform public perception, restore dignity, and decisively alter the narrative in favor of the person who had endured the initial injustice. The shock that rippled through the room when the lawyer intervened was immediate and electric, a sudden disruption to the carefully controlled scene of authority and judgment. Relatives who had moments before nodded in agreement or whispered in speculation were now caught off guard, their expressions flickering between disbelief, curiosity, and cautious reassessment. The abrupt shift in energy created a heightened sense of tension, as the balance of power that had seemed so absolute moments ago was suddenly destabilized. The protagonist felt a surge of vindication mixed with relief, knowing that the hidden evidence and the lawyer's authority would finally confront the narrative that had been imposed on them in front of everyone. Every eye in the room turned, some widened in surprise, others narrowed as the implications sank in, and a palpable ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, signaling the shift from passive observation to active engagement with the truth. The interruption forced the authority figure into a moment of unexpected vulnerability, as the carefully staged public reprimand now faced scrutiny that could not be ignored or dismissed. Timing played a critical role in this effect. The lawyer's entrance had been delayed just long enough to maximize anticipation, ensuring that the revelation would land with full impact and that the audience, the relatives, would fully register the contrast between perceived wrongdoing and actual facts. For the protagonist, the moment was a culmination of strategy and endurance, a turning point where patience and composure met the opportunity for justice. The shock experienced by the room also served as a mirror, reflecting the discrepancy between appearances and reality, and highlighting how easily assumptions can be manipulated until confronted with incontrovertible proof. This emotional and psychological jolt reinforced the protagonist's position, demonstrating that public perception is not fixed and that carefully presented truth can decisively alter collective understanding. The ripple effect of surprise extended beyond immediate reactions. Relationships, judgments, and unspoken alliances in the family began to shift subtly as each individual recalibrated their understanding of the scenario. The protagonist observed these changes with a mixture of satisfaction and calculated attention, knowing that the shock was not merely for dramatic effect, but also a mechanism for realignment, ensuring that authority, credibility, and social perception were restored in accordance with reality. In this charged atmosphere, the shock served as both a climax and a catalyst, transforming the narrative from one of humiliation and helplessness into a moment of public recognition, accountability, and moral victory, where the interplay of timing, evidence, and external authority reshaped the room's energy and established a lasting shift in how truth, judgment, and respect were perceived. The moment the truth was revealed, it carried a weight that seemed to ripple through the room, altering the perception of every person present. The lawyer's presentation of evidence transformed what had been a scene of unilateral judgment into a tableau of clarity and accountability. Each piece of proof, whether documents, messages, or corroborating statements, was delivered with precision, leaving no room for dismissal, doubt, or reinterpretation. The protagonist felt a profound sense of vindication, a release of tension built over the long minutes of public humiliation, as the carefully constructed narrative that had once held power now began to unravel. Relatives shifted in their seats, expressions fluctuating between surprise, incredulity, and a dawning understanding that the initial judgment had been based on incomplete or misleading information. The revelation of truth did not merely counter the previous accusations, it reframed the entire event, casting the protagonist not as the subject of discipline but as someone wronged by perception and circumstance. There was an almost tangible shift in authority as the undeniable facts replaced opinion, rumor, and assumption, transforming the room from one of tension and imbalance into one of acknowledgement and recalibration. The protagonist's patience and composure, maintained through the initial humiliation, now paid off, as the careful endurance of scrutiny had positioned them perfectly to capitalize on the impact of the truth. The audience of relatives, who had been silent, whispering, or judgmental, was now compelled to adjust their understanding, reassessing prior reactions and perhaps reconsidering their own readiness to pass judgment without evidence. The authority figure, once commanding, was now confronted with the implications of misjudgment, their credibility subtly weakened by the clarity of facts presented by someone outside the personal dynamics of the family. For the protagonist, the revelation was both emotional and strategic, providing a sense of personal justice while also demonstrating the power of preparation, observation, and patience. The unfolding of events illustrated how perception can be manipulated in the absence of truth, and how carefully preserved evidence, presented at the right moment, can decisively reverse narratives, alter relationships, and restore dignity. The room, initially charged with tension and shame, now resonated with acknowledgement of reality, marking a turning point where humiliation gave way to empowerment, judgment was replaced by recognition, and the careful orchestration of timing, patience, and truth allowed the protagonist to reclaim authority over their own story and assert control over social perception in a manner that was both public and undeniable. The feeling of vindication that swept over the protagonist was profound and multi-layered, emerging from the culmination of tension, patience, and strategic observation. For so long, the public humiliation had felt like a permanent mark, a moment of powerlessness reinforced by the scrutiny of 30 relatives and the authority figure's dominance. Yet as the truth was revealed, that sense of oppression lifted, replaced by an internal acknowledgement that justice had finally been served. Vindication was not merely about proving innocence or correcting a misperception, it was about reclaiming dignity, re-establishing control over the narrative, and demonstrating that composure and strategy could outlast impulsive displays of authority. Every reaction in the room reinforced this transformation: the relative's surprise, the subtle shift in expressions from judgment to understanding, and the subtle unease in the authority figure, all confirmed that the truth had reshaped perception. The protagonist experienced a mixture of relief, pride, and a quiet triumph, understanding that the previous humiliation had set the stage for a more powerful reversal. This feeling was deeply intertwined with the awareness that endurance and observation had been essential tools, allowing the moment of revelation to carry maximum impact. Vindication also carried a social dimension, as the audience of relatives now witnessed the correctness of the protagonist's position and the injustice of the prior assumption, which subtly altered family dynamics and respect. It was a form of empowerment that went beyond personal satisfaction, demonstrating to all present that patience, preparation, and evidence could challenge authority and social perception in a lasting way. The protagonist's internal state reflected a combination of emotional release and calculated recognition. Every ounce of prior discomfort and embarrassment was now reframed as necessary preparation for the public affirmation of truth. The vindication was amplified by the public nature of the event, transforming what had initially been a source of shame into a moment of moral and social triumph, where the narrative could no longer be controlled by unilateral judgment. The experience also reinforced an understanding of timing, leverage, and the strategic presentation of evidence, highlighting how perception can be shifted decisively when truth is coupled with authority and observation. In this moment, the protagonist's sense of vindication became both a personal and social triumph, turning public scrutiny into a stage for empowerment, demonstrating that the careful orchestration of patience, strategy, and evidence can not only restore dignity, but also permanently redefine relationships, perceptions, and authority within a highly charged social environment. The reactions of the relatives after the truth was revealed created a complex and transformative atmosphere, shifting the energy of the room from one of judgment and tension to one of recognition and recalibration. Initially, many family members had been passive observers, some silently agreeing with the authority figure, others unsure of how to react, and a few perhaps quietly questioning the fairness of the situation. As the lawyer presented the undeniable evidence, every subtle expression, every glance, and every whisper began to change, reflecting the new understanding that the protagonist had been wronged. Surprise and incredulity rippled through the group, punctuated by shifting body language, raised eyebrows, widened eyes, and murmurs of acknowledgement that silently confirmed a reassessment of prior judgments. The protagonist observed these shifts carefully, noting which relatives seemed most affected, which were slow to adjust, and which might still cling to their initial assumptions. Each reaction added to a tapestry of social dynamics, revealing not only personal biases but also the influence of evidence and authority in reshaping perception. The relatives' responses served as both validation and reinforcement of the protagonist's patience and composure during the earlier humiliation, demonstrating how endurance had preserved credibility in the face of public scrutiny. There was also a subtle sense of social accountability, as family members who had initially aligned with the authority figure now had to reconcile their prior assumptions with the undeniable reality, a process that reshaped respect and relationships in real time. The ripple effect extended beyond immediate emotions, influencing how the family might interact in the future, and creating an unspoken acknowledgement that truth and evidence outweigh appearances and assumptions. For the protagonist, witnessing this transformation was both empowering and instructive, highlighting the power of timing, preparation, and strategy in navigating complex social hierarchies. The relatives' reactions illustrated that perception is malleable and that public acknowledgement of truth can decisively shift power dynamics, even in a tightly knit and emotionally charged environment. Each subtle cue, from softened expressions to tentative smiles, contributed to a growing sense of justice, reinforcing the protagonist's emerging authority within the room. This collective adjustment underscored the broader lesson that patience, observation, and strategic action, combined with credible evidence, can convert humiliation into recognition, reshaping social hierarchies and ensuring that integrity and truth command attention and respect in even the most challenging of public circumstances. The timing of the lawyer's arrival played a crucial role in the unfolding of events, amplifying the tension and impact of the entire scenario. Every second leading up to that moment had been charged with anticipation, a careful orchestration that balanced endurance, observation, and strategic patience. The protagonist understood that revealing the evidence too early might diminish its effect, while waiting too long risked prolonging humiliation without guarantee of resolution. This delicate balance created a heightened awareness of every detail: the expressions of the relatives, the tone of the authority figure, the rhythm of conversation, and the subtle cues in the room that indicated readiness for intervention. The entrance of the lawyer was timed to maximize disruption of the existing power dynamic, introducing an external authority capable of validating the protagonist's position and exposing the truth in a way that could not be dismissed or ignored. This precision in timing transformed the scenario from mere endurance of public judgment into a carefully staged reversal, where the impact of the revelation was amplified by the audience's anticipation and the contrast between prior assumptions and the incoming truth. The relatives, previously aligned with or passively observing the authority figure's narrative, were caught off guard, their attention shifting instantly to the new presence and the promise of clarification. For the protagonist, the timing underscored the importance of patience and foresight, demonstrating that a moment of restraint and calculated observation could convert vulnerability into advantage. The arrival acted as a pivot point, converting the energy of embarrassment, judgment, and tension into anticipation, curiosity, and eventual acknowledgement. It highlighted the psychological effect of suspense, showing how prolonged exposure to uncertainty, when coupled with strategic intervention, magnifies the impact of truth. Every reaction in the room, from subtle shifts in posture to widened eyes and exchanged glances, was intensified by the sense that the narrative was about to be challenged in a decisive and authoritative manner. The protagonist could sense the subtle recalibration of social dynamics as the lawyer approached, realizing that timing alone could transform a scenario of humiliation into one of empowerment and public recognition. This understanding reinforced a broader principle that in situations of apparent vulnerability, carefully controlled timing, observation, and preparation are as powerful as the evidence itself. The precise moment of intervention ensured that the truth would land with maximum force, reshaping perception, restoring credibility, and transforming the emotional and social energy of the room from judgment and discomfort into acknowledgement, justice, and a profound shift in authority and respect. The reversal of embarrassment into public triumph marked a turning point in the protagonist's experience, transforming a moment that had once felt crushing into one of empowerment and validation. Initially, the room had been charged with tension, scrutiny, and judgment, each relative observing and interpreting every gesture, word, and expression, reinforcing the weight of the public humiliation. The authority figure's dominance had seemed absolute, and the protagonist's discomfort had been amplified by the presence of 30 witnesses, creating a scenario where power, perception, and social pressure converged. Yet, with the strategic arrival of the lawyer and the presentation of undeniable evidence, the narrative shifted dramatically, overturning the carefully constructed display of authority. The reversal was not instantaneous in its emotional effect. It began subtly, with fleeting expressions of surprise, hesitation, and recalibration on the faces of relatives, then expanded into a broader acknowledgement of the protagonist's position and the inaccuracy of the prior judgment. This transformation carried multiple layers. It validated the protagonist's endurance and patience, highlighted the effectiveness of strategic observation, and demonstrated the power of truth when presented with authority and timing. The room, once a stage for judgment and humiliation, became a platform for recognition, where the protagonist's composure and careful management of the situation were rewarded with public acknowledgement. The embarrassment that had been imposed externally was replaced with an internal and social sense of triumph, as the power dynamic shifted and the authority figure was forced into a position of exposure and recalibration. Every subtle cue from the relatives, the softened expressions, the nods of understanding, the murmurs of acknowledgement, reinforced the reversal, turning scrutiny into admiration and misunderstanding into clarity. The protagonist experienced a profound sense of agency, realizing that moments of vulnerability, when navigated with patience, observation, and strategic foresight, can be transformed into opportunities for empowerment. This reversal also had lasting implications for relationships and social perception, demonstrating that humiliation is often temporary and contingent on timing, preparation, and presentation. By enduring the initial public judgment, the protagonist had not only preserved dignity, but had also created the conditions for a dramatic shift in perception, turning what had once been a scene of exposure into one of undeniable triumph, and proving that control over narrative, strategic patience, and the careful orchestration of truth can convert a moment of apparent weakness into a lasting demonstration of resilience, authority, and public vindication. The emotional payoff that followed the revelation of the truth was profound, layered with relief, satisfaction, and a renewed sense of empowerment that contrasted sharply with the earlier humiliation. The protagonist had endured a public grounding in front of 30 relatives, a moment of intense scrutiny that had forced every word, gesture, and reaction to be carefully measured. The buildup of tension, fear, and embarrassment had been nearly unbearable, as the room seemed to magnify every imperfection and amplify the sense of exposure. Yet, as the lawyer presented the hidden evidence, the atmosphere shifted, replacing judgment with acknowledgement, whispers of doubt with nods of understanding, and confusion with clarity. This emotional payoff was not simply about personal satisfaction, it was the culmination of strategic patience, careful observation, and the deliberate maintenance of composure during the period of public scrutiny. The protagonist could finally feel the weight of embarrassment lift, replaced by a quiet yet potent sense of justice that resonated both internally and socially. Each reaction in the room, from the relative's widened eyes to the subtle discomfort of the authority figure, reinforced the effectiveness of timing, preparation, and the power of undeniable evidence. The emotional impact was further intensified by the contrast between the protagonist's prior vulnerability and the current recognition of truth, highlighting the psychological arc from humiliation to empowerment. This moment of payoff also carried a social dimension, as family members began to recalibrate their perceptions, reassessing previous assumptions and acknowledging the protagonist's resilience and credibility. Internally, the protagonist experienced a mix of relief, pride, and quiet triumph, understanding that the endurance of scrutiny had been instrumental in creating the conditions for the revelation to land with maximum impact. The emotional payoff was inseparable from the strategic elements that led to it. The careful observation of the audience, the preservation of evidence, the timing of the lawyer's arrival, and the ability to maintain composure under pressure. It was a vivid illustration of how patience and planning can transform moments of apparent vulnerability into opportunities for validation and authority. The intensity of the earlier shame magnified the satisfaction of this reversal, making the recognition of truth feel even more powerful and deserved. Ultimately, the emotional payoff represented the synthesis of endurance, strategy, and moral justice, turning what had been a public spectacle of embarrassment into a stage for vindication, empowerment, and the restoration of dignity, leaving both the protagonist and the observers with an unmistakable awareness of the transformative power of truth and timing. The concept of revenge through truth, rather than impulsive retaliation, became central to the protagonist's experience, transforming the humiliation into an opportunity for calculated empowerment. While the initial grounding in front of 30 relatives had sparked anger, embarrassment, and frustration, the protagonist recognized that reacting impulsively would only reinforce the public narrative and magnify vulnerability. Instead, patience and observation became tools of strategy, allowing the situation to unfold while subtle assessments were made of the room, the authority figure, and the relatives' reactions. By holding back immediate retaliation, the protagonist preserved the ability to wield the ultimate form of revenge, undeniable truth. This approach required emotional control, discipline, and foresight, as every moment of composure added to the eventual impact of the revelation. The hidden evidence, carefully maintained and revealed at the right moment, served as the mechanism through which this revenge could be exacted. Unlike rash confrontations, which often escalate conflict without changing perception, presenting the truth strategically altered the audience's understanding, exposed the authority figure's misjudgment, and validated the protagonist's position. Each relative's reaction became part of the larger effect, as surprise, acknowledgement, and subtle shifts in respect reinforced the reversal of the initial humiliation. The strategy of revenge through truth also demonstrated the power of preparation and timing. The lawyer's entrance was not merely procedural but symbolic, providing external authority to amplify the impact of the evidence. The calculated pacing, from enduring the public grounding to presenting irrefutable proof, ensured that the reversal was complete, leaving no room for dispute or doubt. For the protagonist, this approach was both personally satisfying and socially transformative, as it showcased intelligence, resilience, and patience over impulsive emotion. It also reframed the concept of revenge, showing that the most effective form is often indirect, enduring temporary discomfort, observing carefully, and striking decisively with credibility and truth. The audience of relatives, initially complicit in or passive to the humiliation, became witnesses to a reversal that emphasized fairness, insight, and moral authority. By choosing truth over immediate retaliation, the protagonist not only regained dignity, but also reshaped social perception, demonstrating that patience, strategic thinking, and the careful orchestration of evidence can turn public embarrassment into empowerment, shame into validation, and a moment of judgment into an enduring story of clever, calculated triumph, where the ultimate revenge lies in exposing reality and restoring balance in a way that is both undeniable and irreversible. The way family gossip rippled through the room added another layer of complexity to the protagonist's ordeal, turning the public grounding into a spectacle that extended beyond mere judgment and into social storytelling. Relatives who had initially been silent or passively observing began to exchange whispers, subtle glances, and speculative comments, each interaction contributing to a network of perception that amplified the embarrassment. These murmurs were more than idle chatter. They carried implicit judgments, reinforced alliances, and created a collective narrative that framed the protagonist's behavior in the worst possible light. The protagonist, acutely aware of these dynamics, recognized that the gossip itself was both a weapon and an opportunity. Every whisper or exchange documented in memory became a record of perception, a layer of social awareness that could later be influenced or corrected with the presentation of undeniable truth. As the lawyer entered and evidence was revealed, the very channels through which gossip had spread now served to amplify the reversal, as those who had been quick to speculate were forced to reconsider and recalibrate their understanding. The social mechanics of gossip made the earlier humiliation more intense, but it also ensured that the impact of the vindication would be magnified. Relatives who had been spreading or internalizing assumptions now had to confront the reality that the narrative they had been shaping was incomplete or incorrect. This created a subtle but powerful form of social justice, as the truth not only restored the protagonist's dignity, but also reshaped the flow of information and perception within the family network. The protagonist could observe the shifts in posture, tone, and expression, noting how former gossipers adjusted their behavior, some with awkward acknowledgement, others with subtle attempts to reconcile prior comments with the new understanding. This interplay highlighted the dual nature of family gossip. While it can inflict temporary shame and influence perception, it also magnifies the effect of a strategic revelation, making the restoration of credibility more public and impactful. For the protagonist, this dynamic reinforced the value of patience, strategic timing, and the careful management of perception. By enduring gossip and scrutiny without reacting impulsively, and by preserving evidence for maximum effect, the protagonist turned the very mechanisms that had amplified humiliation into instruments of empowerment and public acknowledgement. Ultimately, the social ripple caused by gossip became part of the larger narrative of vindication, showing that in environments where reputation and perception are constantly negotiated, the careful orchestration of truth can decisively alter relationships, restore dignity, and transform the whispers of judgment into recognition of insight, fairness, and resilience. The lesson embedded in the ordeal extended beyond personal vindication, highlighting the broader importance of honesty, patience, and the dangers of hasty judgment. Experiencing public grounding in front of 30 relatives exposed the protagonist not only to immediate embarrassment, but also to the consequences of assumptions made without full knowledge of the situation. The reactions of family members, ranging from silent judgment to whispered gossip, underscored how quickly perception can diverge from reality, and how easily people can be swayed by appearances rather than facts. This dynamic revealed a critical moral principle: decisions and criticisms imposed without understanding often lead to unfair treatment and the misallocation of social power. The presence of hidden evidence and the eventual intervention of the lawyer illustrated how truth, when revealed strategically, can correct these misperceptions. But the underlying lesson remained that premature assumptions can have lasting social and emotional effects. For the protagonist, this experience reinforced the value of maintaining composure, observing carefully, and strategically planning the timing of responses, demonstrating that patience and clarity of thought are essential in navigating complex social hierarchies. Furthermore, the scenario highlighted the interplay between perception, authority, and evidence, showing that people's judgments are often influenced by context rather than objective truth. The relatives' shift from judgment to acknowledgement following the lawyer's intervention emphasized that fairness and accuracy are only recognized when credible information is presented, underlining the moral imperative of withholding final judgment until all facts are understood. This experience also conveyed an implicit caution to the audience: social influence, gossip, and authority can magnify misunderstandings, but these forces can be countered with truth, preparation, and timing. For the protagonist, the lesson extended beyond personal empowerment into an understanding of human behavior and social dynamics, reinforcing the idea that enduring temporary humiliation with strategic foresight allows for a more complete and just resolution. The incident demonstrated that patience and the careful orchestration of evidence not only restore dignity, but also serve as a subtle critique of those who wield authority without accountability. By converting a moment of public embarrassment into a stage for truth and recognition, the protagonist illustrated how moral and strategic intelligence can triumph over impulsive judgment and social pressure, emphasizing that lessons in fairness, perception, and patience are not abstract. They are lived experiences that shape relationships, influence social narratives, and define the capacity for justice, integrity, and enduring respect within any community of observers. The dramatic tension throughout the event was a constant undercurrent, shaping both the protagonist's experience and the reactions of everyone in the room. From the moment of public grounding in front of 30 relatives, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation, uncertainty, and unspoken power dynamics. Every word, gesture, and glance contributed to a growing sense of suspense as the protagonist navigated the delicate balance between endurance and observation. The relatives' expressions fluctuated, some curious, some judgmental, and others quietly speculative, amplifying the emotional weight of the situation. Each subtle movement, from a shifting posture to a fleeting smirk, seemed magnified under the collective gaze, heightening the tension and reinforcing the sense that the entire event was being scrutinized and recorded in memory. The protagonist, while feeling the weight of embarrassment and vulnerability, also became acutely aware of the suspense, noting the timing of interactions, the relative positions of family members, and the authority figure's tone and delivery. This heightened awareness allowed for a strategic perspective, understanding that the tension itself could be leveraged when the moment of truth arrived. The eventual entrance of the lawyer with hidden evidence in hand served as the climax of this carefully built suspense, transforming the energy in the room almost instantaneously. The dramatic tension magnified the impact of the revelation, as relatives who had been passively observing were now forced to confront undeniable proof, their prior assumptions challenged in real time. The protagonist experienced the payoff of this tension not only emotionally but strategically, as the careful pacing and observation made the reversal of perception more powerful and undeniable. The suspense created by the prolonged period of scrutiny ensured that when the truth was revealed, it landed with maximum impact, reshaping the authority dynamic, altering social perception, and amplifying the sense of vindication. This tension also highlighted the psychological interplay between vulnerability and control, showing that the perception of risk and anticipation can heighten both emotional engagement and the eventual sense of empowerment. For the protagonist, the drama of the situation was not merely external, it was internalized as a careful orchestration of patience, observation, and timing, where every second of suspense added weight to the ultimate reversal. The intense build-up, combined with the carefully timed revelation, demonstrated how dramatic tension can be used as a tool to amplify outcomes, ensuring that humiliation is transformed into empowerment, authority is tested, and the emotional arc from judgment to vindication is felt fully by all present. The psychological impact of public humiliation in front of 30 relatives was profound, shaping the protagonist's emotions, thoughts, and strategies in ways that went far beyond the immediate embarrassment. Being disciplined in such a public setting created a heightened sense of vulnerability, where every gesture, word, and reaction was magnified under the scrutiny of multiple observers. The protagonist experienced a mixture of shame, anger, and disbelief, compounded by the awareness that relatives' interpretations could influence long-term perceptions of character and credibility. Each relative became both witness and judge. Their subtle expressions, raised eyebrows, whispered comments, or nods of approval, adding layers to the internal pressure and forcing the protagonist to manage responses carefully. This psychological tension created a dual awareness, externally maintaining composure and internally analyzing the situation, cataloging reactions, and noting vulnerabilities in the authority figure's position that might later be used strategically. The experience also highlighted the fragility of perception and the power of observation. The way people interpret behavior in public can significantly impact relationships, respect, and social standing. The protagonist's mind shifted between processing emotional responses and developing a tactical approach, understanding that immediate reactions could either exacerbate humiliation or preserve credibility for a more decisive moment of vindication. This internal balancing act required resilience, patience, and self-control, as each second of scrutiny tested the ability to withstand social pressure while preparing for eventual reversal. The hidden evidence and the eventual arrival of the lawyer became focal points for psychological relief, representing not just the promise of factual vindication, but also the empowerment that comes from knowing the truth will ultimately prevail. Observing relatives' behavior during this period further informed the protagonist's understanding of human dynamics, social influence, and the complex interplay of authority, perception, and judgment. The psychological impact was not only immediate but also instructive, shaping a deeper awareness of how to navigate public scrutiny, manage personal responses, and use patience and strategic timing to convert vulnerability into strength. By enduring the humiliation with composure and leveraging the situation through preparation and timing, the protagonist transformed psychological pressure into a tool for empowerment, turning public embarrassment into a staged reversal, and demonstrating that even in highly charged social environments, self-control, insight, and the deliberate orchestration of truth can decisively shift perception, restore dignity, and assert authority over narrative and social interpretation. The strategic patience exercised by the protagonist was central to the eventual outcome, transforming a moment of public humiliation into an opportunity for calculated empowerment. From the onset, being grounded in front of 30 relatives created a high-pressure environment where impulsive reactions could have intensified embarrassment and reinforced the authority figure's dominance. Instead of responding emotionally, the protagonist recognized the importance of endurance, observation, and careful mental preparation. Each second of restraint allowed for the accumulation of critical insights about the dynamics in the room, which relatives were sympathetic, which were silently judging, and which were likely to be influenced by the presentation of evidence. This patience was not passive but active, a process of strategic observation and internal cataloging that ensured every detail would later serve a purpose. The hidden evidence, preserved and withheld until the right moment, became a tool of leverage that relied entirely on this deliberate approach. By waiting, the protagonist ensured that the revelation would have maximum impact, with the reactions of relatives amplifying the effect and reinforcing the reversal of public perception. The strategic timing of the lawyer's entrance further demonstrated how patience can be used to orchestrate a moment of undeniable authority, transforming a situation that initially appeared entirely disadvantageous into one of control and empowerment. During the period of restraint, the protagonist also strengthened emotional resilience, learning to manage internal anger, embarrassment, and frustration without allowing them to manifest in ways that could undermine credibility. This emotional control complemented the tactical patience, creating a dual layer of readiness, psychological composure, and strategic positioning. Observing the reactions of relatives and the authority figure while withholding immediate response heightened the eventual dramatic impact of the evidence, ensuring that the narrative could be decisively shifted. The value of strategic patience extended beyond the immediate situation, highlighting a broader lesson about navigating social hierarchies and public scrutiny. Measured restraint, combined with careful preparation, can convert vulnerability into leverage, humiliation into empowerment, and temporary imbalance into long-term authority. The protagonist's choice to endure, observe, and act only at the precise moment transformed a potentially disempowering experience into a carefully managed reversal, demonstrating that patience is not merely waiting, but a conscious, purposeful tool that can influence perception, timing, and outcome. By exercising this discipline, the protagonist ensured that truth, preparation, and timing would work in tandem to restore dignity, assert authority, and turn a moment of public judgment into a lasting display of insight, strategy, and social vindication. The impact of public perception in shaping the protagonist's experience was profound, revealing how social judgment can magnify feelings of vulnerability, shame, and pressure. Being disciplined in front of 30 relatives created a heightened awareness that every gesture, tone, and expression could influence not only immediate opinions but also long-term narratives about character and credibility. The protagonist felt the weight of observation intensely, as if under a microscope, where even subtle movements, shifting posture, a pause before speaking, or a slight change in facial expression, were interpreted and analyzed by multiple observers simultaneously. This acute sensitivity to perception forced the protagonist to carefully regulate outward behavior while internally processing emotions such as embarrassment, anger, and frustration. The presence of hidden evidence and the eventual intervention of the lawyer highlighted the malleable nature of public perception. What initially seemed absolute judgment could be reframed and corrected when supported by undeniable proof and authoritative presentation. Observing relatives' reactions became a key element in understanding the fluidity of social perception, as their expressions shifted from judgment to surprise, disbelief, and eventually acknowledgement. This process emphasized the power of timing, preparation, and strategic intervention in reshaping how others interpret actions and events. The protagonist realized that perception is not merely an individual response, but a collective phenomenon, influenced by social dynamics, alliances, and the presence of authority figures. The contrast between initial assumptions and later recognition demonstrated how quickly opinions can change when confronted with evidence, reinforcing the importance of patience, observation, and deliberate action. Public perception also functioned as both a challenge and a tool. While it initially amplified humiliation, it ultimately magnified the impact of the protagonist's vindication, as the audience of relatives witnessed the reversal in real time. Every shift in posture, murmur, or nod became part of a broader social acknowledgement, turning what had been a scene of vulnerability into a stage for empowerment. The experience illustrated that managing public perception requires a combination of emotional resilience, strategic thinking, and timing, highlighting the interplay between appearance and truth. For the protagonist, this insight was invaluable. Enduring scrutiny, observing behavior, and leveraging evidence transformed perception from a source of shame into a mechanism for recognition, authority, and long-term respect. By understanding the power of collective interpretation, the protagonist not only navigated immediate humiliation, but also reshaped relationships, established credibility, and demonstrated that perception, while initially influential, can be decisively aligned with truth through strategy, patience, and calculated action. The transformation from humiliation to empowerment was a gradual but profound process, shaped by the interplay of patience, observation, and the strategic presentation of truth. Initially, the protagonist had been subjected to a deeply public and uncomfortable grounding in front of 30 relatives, an experience that magnified feelings of vulnerability, embarrassment, and self-consciousness. Every movement, word, and expression was under scrutiny, creating a pressure that was both emotional and social, as relatives silently or overtly judged, whispered, and interpreted the unfolding scenario. Despite the intensity of the moment, the protagonist recognized that reacting impulsively would only reinforce the narrative imposed by the authority figure and further entrench public perception of wrongdoing. Instead, the focus shifted inward, to endurance, strategic thinking, and the careful cataloging of evidence and social cues. Each observation, whether a glance, a shift in posture, or a subtle expression, was mentally noted, contributing to a comprehensive understanding of the dynamics at play and informing the eventual plan for reversal. The hidden evidence, preserved and strategically revealed with the arrival of the lawyer, served as the critical catalyst for this transformation, allowing the protagonist to reclaim control over the narrative in a way that was both undeniable and socially impactful. As the truth was revealed, the reactions of relatives shifted, expressions of surprise and recalibration spreading throughout the room, signaling the erosion of the initial authority and judgment that had dominated the event. This shift highlighted the powerful effect of preparation, timing, and evidence on public perception, showing that credibility and dignity can be restored even after a highly charged public humiliation. The protagonist's endurance and composure were validated through the reactions of the audience, who now acknowledged the injustice and misperception that had previously dictated the social dynamic. In this way, humiliation became a preparatory stage for empowerment, demonstrating that patience, careful observation, and the deliberate orchestration of events can transform vulnerability into leverage, embarrassment into recognition, and judgment into acknowledgement of resilience and insight. The experience underscored that social influence, perception, and authority are fluid, and that strategic management of truth and timing can decisively reshape relationships, respect, and narrative control. Ultimately, the protagonist's journey from public humiliation to empowerment exemplifies how adversity, when met with careful planning, emotional control, and insight into social dynamics, can be converted into a lasting affirmation of integrity, authority, and personal triumph. The lasting impact of the entire ordeal was both personal and social, leaving the protagonist with a deep understanding of resilience, strategy, and the dynamics of human perception. Being publicly grounded in front of 30 relatives had initially created a moment of intense vulnerability, where every gesture, expression, and word was scrutinized and interpreted, amplifying embarrassment and the sense of powerlessness. The authority figure's control seemed absolute at the time, and the social environment reinforced compliance, judgment, and observation, creating a high-pressure scenario that tested patience and composure. Yet, the experience became a crucible for learning, highlighting the importance of endurance, careful observation, and strategic timing. The protagonist realized that the initial humiliation, though painful, had provided critical insight into how authority, perception, and social influence operate. By maintaining composure and withholding impulsive reactions, the protagonist preserved credibility and prepared for a reversal that would later demonstrate both insight and resilience. The hidden evidence and the lawyer's timely intervention were pivotal in transforming the narrative, allowing the truth to replace assumption and bias with clarity and validation. This moment revealed the power of strategic patience, the ability to endure temporary discomfort while positioning oneself for maximum impact in the long term. Observing the reactions of relatives as the evidence was revealed provided further insight, showing how quickly judgments based on incomplete information could be corrected and how social perception could shift dramatically when confronted with undeniable facts. The protagonist also gained an acute awareness of the psychological and emotional dimensions of public scrutiny, recognizing that endurance, calm, and strategic insight are essential tools for navigating complex social situations. The reversal of humiliation into empowerment had broader implications beyond the immediate event, demonstrating that authority, credibility, and respect are not fixed, but can be influenced through careful action, timing, and evidence. Socially, the experience reshaped relationships and perceptions, as relatives who had been judgmental or passive witnesses recalibrated their understanding of the protagonist's character, resilience, and intelligence. Personally, the ordeal instilled a lasting sense of confidence, reinforcing the idea that adversity, when met with strategic thought, emotional control, and patience, can be transformed into a powerful demonstration of integrity and empowerment. Ultimately, the experience served as a comprehensive lesson in the interplay of perception, authority, and truth, illustrating that even in the most challenging social circumstances, composure, preparation, and strategic action can convert temporary humiliation into enduring recognition, respect, and personal triumph. In conclusion, this journey from public humiliation to ultimate vindication is more than a story of one moment. It is a testament to the power of patience, strategic thinking, and unwavering composure. Enduring scrutiny in front of 30 relatives could have been crushing, but through observation, preparation, and the careful timing of truth, what once felt like weakness was transformed into strength and judgment into undeniable recognition. The experience illustrates that authority, perception, and social dynamics are never fixed. With insight, courage, and the right strategy, even the most daunting situations can be reversed. It is a reminder that true empowerment does not come from retaliation or impulsive reaction, but from understanding, endurance, and the careful orchestration of actions that allow truth to speak louder than assumption. To everyone listening today, I want to leave you with this. In moments where you feel vulnerable or judged, remember that patience, clarity, and resilience are your greatest allies. Hold on to your truth, observe carefully, and act when the moment is right. Your composure and strategy can turn challenges into triumphs and adversity into lasting recognition. Thank you all for being part of this story and for listening with attention and empathy. Good luck to each of you in facing your own challenges, standing tall in the face of judgment, and turning every setback into an opportunity for growth, empowerment, and undeniable success. Your strength lies not in avoiding hardship, but in the courage and wisdom with which you navigate it.